Alright, welcome to WILLSTAR Mysteries. What I have for you today is 4 Bigfoot reports from the Pacific Northwest, the great state of Washington. One of them is by the Hoh Rainforest, another one by Nestor Peak, and then there's the one by Mt Saint Helens, and also an encounter by an Army Sargeant by Mount Adams. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right there. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. October 1999. Skamania County, Washington. We were on a family outing. My uncle and my 2 brothers and I went up to Mt Saint Helens to look for Bigfoot. My uncle saw a print back in the 60s and has been talking about it all my life. He is getting older now, and this is our first trip to go and look as a group. He has studied Sasquatch for the last 30 years. We drove up Windy Ridge Road from the town Rando all the way to the top overlooking Spirit Lake. The weather was really bad. It was raining and sleeting on and off and very foggy and windy. The parking lot at the top was covered in an inch of slush. The view was obscured by a large cloud. It was like looking into a fog bank. We started driving down the mountain below the level of the clouds, and we stopped at the Cascade Mountain viewpoint, where there is a modular building and a Forest Service road with a locked gate. I stopped the car and was mounting a lens on my camera. My brothers got out of the car to stretch their legs and scan the hills. My uncle was in the back seat of the car with a spotting scope looking down into the meadow to the northeast. My little brother got out of the car and went to the edge of the valley and let out a "Hello!" I told him to shut up and not do that again. But then, from the back seat, my uncle said that the scream from my brother had spooked something down in the meadow, and it was bolting around a hill in the middle of the valley, going from left to right and out of sight, around a small hill about 400 yards away. He described it as large, black, and walking upright. My uncle was too scared to get out of the car. He said us brothers should go and have a look up the road to see if we could get a better vantage point. The 3 of us proceeded to walk up the gated road, leading up a ridge with some smaller knolls that ringed the meadow. It took us the most of 25 minutes up and down the road and 10 minutes scanning the meadow. My brothers and I didn't see it walking off from the vantage point where we were, so we headed back to the car. My Uncle Mac was in the car the whole time watching the area where he had spotted it the first time when we had left up the road. He said that after the 3 of us rounded the hill and where we were out of sight, the large Sasquatch walked back into his view left to right and proceeded back to where it was before, walking by a small black stump, when that stump stood up and it walked off with it leading what must have been a young in the opposite direction the 3 of us were going. He said he lost sight of it as they walked north down deeper into Bear Meadow. We all loaded into the car and drove a little down the mountain, about a half a mile, to the miner's car at the parking lot that is near the southern side of Bismarck Mountain. Clearwater Creek runs out of Meta Lake and under Windy River Road and into Bear Meadow at the miner's car. My uncle and my brothers spread out along the road to see if they could tell where these things crossed the road. I walked down the creek bed from the road into a slight gully and followed it for about 100 yards on the left side, staying near the lowest point along a game trail, when I came up on a broken tree that had been broken for at least a year. It had brown needles on the top. I found a large humanoid footprint on a slope next to the tree. The toes were very noticeable, no claws, and were imprinted in mud. I went back to the car to get plaster in consultation of my older brother, who went to Washington State University and studied under Dr. Krantz. I showed him the print before we poured the cast. He agreed with me that it must be a Bigfoot print. I reminded him that we were in the blast area and no one normally walks in this restricted area on the side of the volcano barefoot. It was really cold and raining, so we gathered half shelves of bark and covered the cast so it would set up overnight. I went back the next day and retrieved the cast. I have the cast and would like to compare it with others from the same area. Skamania County, Washington, July 1991. I served as a U.S. Army Infantry Sergeant at Fort Lewis, Washington for several years. I am also an alpine climber. I went to Mount Adams most of the time because it was much more private than other mountains like St. Helens or Rainier, which have too many people. Another sergeant named Jim Avila, my climbing partner and a good friend, and his golden retriever pup were also there. We were only camping and hiking around this trip since we had the puppy with us. Normally, we would have camped on a snowfield above the tree line. Just after nightfall, we were talking and the puppy was next to the fire. The sky was crystal clear and everything felt normal. Since I spent 6 months out of the year living in the woods and deserts of the western United States and Europe in the Army, the night is my ally. I am an expert at what normal feels like. I needed to go to the bathroom, so I stood up and walked to my right rear about 20 feet where a path led down to a stream. I could hear and see the slow-moving shallow water in this shallow pea-gravel bedded creek. I did my thing and then returned to the fire. We then decided to have some fun and see if we could get a coyote to howl. Although we were not sure if any may have been around, we started our best howls to no avail. We continued for about 5 minutes and then stopped. About an hour passed since my previous trip to go to the bathroom, and I figured I would go again before getting into the sleeping bag. Jim was across from the fire and could see me walking towards a spot overlooking the path to the creek where I intended to void my bladder. As my feet stopped, I could hear footsteps in the dry gravel on the other side of the creek bed about 20 feet away. When it heard me stop, it stopped a little too late and I heard it. I felt intelligence in its movement, not instinct. It knew it had been busted and just froze. I froze and drew my pistol. Jim saw this and at the same time said the puppy flew into the cab of the truck. Jim, also sensing something wrong, drew his pistol and stood up. I was looking right where this guy was standing but could not see him because he was across the water but still in the front of the opposite bank. And he was still frozen like a rock. Jim came to back me up and he did not know what the hell was going on, and instead of telling him to stop, I just kept my eyes glued to the spot I knew the guy was at, and he finally decided to move out. He took 2 strides up the bank away from me with a look over his right shoulder as he was moving away to the right. His look was concerned mixed with a childlike fear, as if he really wanted to introduce himself in some way to our wolf calling group. Also puzzled like, why are you idiots calling coyotes? You're humans, stupid. The most animal-like trait was a sort of very brief mock anger face, which looked like an afterthought just before the big guy went into the woods. I looked at Jim. No words. We threw most of our stuff in the truck and left in a big hurry. There was no way I was staying in the woods that night. The big guy was huge, but slender as I recall. Don't ask me how, but I know he was an adolescent. He was sort of like a big kid, but moved like the wind. He saw my eyes and I saw his. I swear this account to be true. Thank you, and Godspeed in your search for Sasquatch. Klickitat County, Washington, October 1982. Hi, I recently heard a show called Coast to Coast AM during my graveyard shift and decided maybe it's time to tell someone about my sighting years ago while I was hunting. I grew up in Skamania County, Washington. That's in the lower central part of the state. I spent my youth hiking and exploring the woods with my father. I had heard of Bigfoot sightings growing up and remember a story in the Skamania County Pioneer newspaper about a deputy sheriff seeing one and getting a cast of his foot. Anyway, I didn't believe at all in them because I had covered a lot of dense forest land and never saw anything or heard anything. My father told me he had found a footprint when he was in his 20s hunting. It was in a patch of snow and he said it was kinda old, but he said it wasn't anything like he'd ever seen. It was about 18 inches long by about maybe 7 to 8 inches wide, with toes and a deep impression. So I've never told this story to anyone except one old-timer who was a trapper and seen them several times. So here's my story. It was hunting season in the fall of 1982. I was 21 years old and hunting an area of eastern Skamania County called the Nestor Peak area. It has an old fire lookout on top of the highest peak, which is no longer in use. It's pretty rugged country, even though it's not all that far from some small towns. I had scouted the area several weeks prior to the hunting season and saw a lot of sign and tree rubs, and about 3 days before opening morning, I saw a beautiful 4-point buck checking its rub. So opening morning, I got in there about an hour before light and waited. About half an hour after light, I heard a loud snap and some loud rustling in the brush, but never saw anything. The area I was sitting at was at the top of a ravine or small draw with a road and a mountain behind me, and the other side of the ravine's side hill in front of me, with a deep rugged canyon behind that. After a while, I decided to hike over the other side and see if there was any fresh sign. As I got towards the top of the other side, I heard a lot of noise and something going over the hill towards the canyon. I approached slow but never saw anything, but there was this god-awful smell in the air. It's hard to explain, but it smelled like an old, wet, musty dog that had rolled in some cow manure, but really strong and stinky. It was not pleasant to say the least. I thought maybe it was a bear because I've smelled bear before, but it was just different. The next morning I went to the same place and waited. I heard noise down the ravine a ways. A few minutes later I saw something walking up the other side of the hill. I thought it was a bear, but then I looked through my scope and was looking at a gorilla type animal. It didn't really look like a gorilla, but that's all I could think of. It didn't seem real big. It was probably 80 to 100 yards away. Its head was wide and tall. Its arms were big and they didn't go past the knees. Thick hair on the back, top of the head, and legs. Thinner on the chest and face. I moved, kneeled down behind a stump, and picked up my binoculars. It heard me, and the noise it made was unreal. Like a cougar scream. But just different, and it dropped to the ground like it was hiding. Then I heard more noise, and from the right came another one, which was a lot bigger. It leaned down by the other one, and it stood up and looked right at me. It was much bigger, probably 3 feet taller than the other one. It had a lot of hair on its shoulders, hanging down and thick. Its face was not that covered though, and through the binoculars I could see its eyes, which were big and dark. Kinda human-like though, and a human-type nose with large nostrils. A mouth that was straight across, and I saw its teeth when it opened its mouth. They were big and flat, not pointed. I could hear it breathing from where I was at. It was loud and deep. It was a lighter color, and if I had to say what color, I'd say it had dark brown in places and reddish in other places. It had huge, hairy legs, and I couldn't see much of its feet though. The smaller ones stood up, and they walked slowly up the hill, stopping every 50 feet or so, and looked at me. I'd say the big one was maybe 7 to 8 foot tall, but not any taller than 8 foot, and maybe 400 to 500 pounds. Not like the stories I've heard of 13 foot tall and 1,000 pounds. They got to the top of the hill, and another one came up from the right. It was just a little shorter than the big one, and kinda hard to see. It was probably there in view, but I just didn't see it earlier as I was looking at the others. They walked out of sight over the hill into the canyon. I just sat there and was questioning myself what I had just saw. I was scared but just totally amazed. I left the area and went home. I wished I had a camera so bad, but I'll always have the vision in my head. I went back there about 3 days later and walked over to where the little one had kneeled down. There was some hair on a bush about 6 inches long, but not much, and there was a few footprints around. I have a size 11 shoe, and I put my foot in the biggest one I could find, and it was probably 3 inches wider and 5 inches longer than my boot. So like maybe 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. There were some huge 3-foot rocks rolled over, and you could see that they had dug under them. But not a lot of tracks, even though I knew there were 3 animals there, and no sign of where they went over the bank into the canyon. Anyway, that's my encounter, and I doubt I'll tell it again. February 2016, Jefferson County, Washington. My name is Tim. My wife Nan and I live between Newburgh and Wilsonville, Oregon. On February 24th, 2016, we decided to take a couple days off and drive up to the Olympic Peninsula. We drove up to Olympia, Washington, and took Highway 101 route along the Hood Canal through Port Angeles to Forks, where we stayed the night at the Forks Motel. Early on the morning of February 25th, a Thursday, we drove south on Highway 101 to Upper Hoh Road and east to the Hoh Rainforest. It was a beautiful, clear, and dry day, which was unusual for February on the peninsula. After an enjoyable walk through the rainforest, we headed back west on the Upper Hoh Road. There was very little traffic in either direction, and we pretty much had the road to ourselves. Approximately halfway back to Highway 101, where the road once again comes close to the Hoh River, we had just cleared a corner and were at the beginning of a straight stretch of road, which I estimate to be about a quarter-mile long, before there was a left-hand corner. At the end of that straight stretch, we both saw a very large bipedal creature walk out of the woods on the north side of the road, stride across the road in 3 strides, and disappear into the woods on the south side of the road. It appeared to be 7 to 8 feet tall and covered in dark hair. We both looked at each other in astonishment with that "did you just see what I just saw?" look on our faces. Without making comment of my own, I asked Nan to describe what she had just seen, and her description was exactly the same as mine. When we got to that spot where we had just seen the creature appear from the woods, we stopped and examined the site. The road was in an area that was still within the Olympic National Forest, and the woods were so thick on each side of the road that it was difficult to see more than a few feet into the woods to the north. The trees were just as thick on the south side of the road, but we could tell that we were very close to the Hoh River. There was no trail whatsoever coming out of the woods or going into the woods on the south side of the road. Under the circumstances, we could only surmise that we had just seen a Bigfoot that was apparently going across the road to reach the river. Even though I never doubted the existence of Bigfoot, I always considered myself a professional skeptic. Yes, it most certainly could exist, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, where there are enormous tracts of land that are virtually unexplored, but I would prefer to see proof of it prior to confirmation. I am now a confirmed believer, as is Nan. Alright, there it is, 4 encounters from the great state of Washington. You guys leave me some comments, let me know what you thought about those. If you have your own encounter you would like to share, make sure you send it to me at WILLSTARBIGFOOT@AOL.com. If you're new to the channel and you liked what you saw, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And everybody, if you liked the video, make sure you smash that like button for me. That's where we're going to leave it. Always remember, where there is a WILLSTAR, there is a way. WILLSTAR out.